So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Laura Wood, our speaker for today on life and survival mode. Danger, fear, and conflict and abuse have sadly impacted many of us and are often, or our families, and are often a painful reality for our patients and friends too. And this session will introduce how the incredible human brain which God created and how the body adapts to threat, especially during the sensitive developmental window from before birth to around 26 years of age. And so Laura will explore what developmental or psychological trauma can look like, how stress and trauma can affect our biology, and importantly, how to support people living in survival mode. And as we're all humans beings caring for other human beings, this session is aiming to help us understand both ourselves and others better. Now, Dr. Laura Wood is a pediatrician. She's got a special interest in human trafficking, childhood trauma recovery, and health justice. She's also the research director and child and family lead at VITA, V-I-T-A, a clinician-led organization which is dedicated to advancing the health and public health approach to human trafficking. We'll be sending you the link to that when we write to you afterwards. Laura is completing her PhD in human trafficking and health with Lancaster University in the UK, and she's supporting the development of new social medicine and leadership training in the UK. And some might even say, most importantly as well, she's married to Noel Ruparel, who is our ICMDA Regional Secretary for Eurasia. And if we had time, we could hear the wonderful story of how they met in Russia, but I won't go into the details. But Laura, it's just a delight to have you here, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you. Over to you.
Lovely. So thank you so much, Peter, for your warm welcome and for introducing this talk, Life in Survival Mode. Now, many of us here today are health professionals, and that means that our training can often be dominated by the medical model, the clinical way of seeing the world, where health and healthcare can seem focused on disease and disorder, dysfunction and dying. But really the focus of health and why we want to be healthy and well is about life and living and all the ways that our body work to keep us alive, active in the world so we can pursue opportunities, our dreams, and outwork our faith. And it includes how we respond to times when it all seems to go wrong and the journeys of recovery from hurt that we all have to go on. Surviving is our baseline, but of course we really want to thrive. So my aim today in this Life in Survival Mode talk is not so much to talk about mental health and trauma problems or diagnoses, but to remind us all about why and how our, amazing human bodies and brains might respond to events in certain ways in order to keep us alive. Because essentially to the brain, survival is the most important thing, because if we don't survive, nothing else matters. And certainly for me, I know that in my own life and in my work as a doctor and a researcher with survivors of human trafficking and torture, understanding this trauma psychoeducation has been vital, to help me stay healthy, to help me understand myself, as well as other people in my world and my patients. And this is especially so when life has been very hard and I'm experiencing thoughts, images, feelings, changes in my head, in my body that are troubling me. So today is just a short introduction to stress and trauma sciences. And we can only cover a few examples of how our brain and body can respond in survival mode. So if your experiences are different from mine or different from what we cover today, that's absolutely okay, because there is so much diversity, so much complexity. We won't go anywhere near today in the next 30 minutes. And as we go forward as well, please do take a break if you need to, because we're talking about difficult things. And as Peter said, the recording will be available afterwards if you need it. So let's start by clarifying some words. So what do I mean by stress? Okay, so a physiological, a bodily response to situations of increased demand or pressure. It's not just a feeling, okay? And it can be positive, it can be helpful. It doesn't need to be a problem. What about a crisis? Well, this is a time of intense difficulty or danger. And this is usually time limited. And we know that if we're able to navigate a crisis well, with support, it does not have to lead to long-term harm. But what do I mean by trauma? Okay. And I find the definition by the Institute of Recovery from Childhood Trauma very useful. So they state that trauma is an event or series of events such as abuse, neglect, tragedy, war, that causes a profound experience of helplessness leading to terror. So an event or series of events that causes a profound experience of helplessness leading to terror. And trauma is a form of toxic stress. It's a situation of overwhelm. And trauma responses, or being traumatized, refers to the reactions that occur inside us, which are often built upon the foundation of all the life experiences that have gone before this particular or these traumatic incidences. Now, in everyday practice as a doctor, I find it really helpful to think of it as the trauma equation. Okay, so severe fear plus helplessness leads to risk of psychological trauma, traumatization. Okay, severe fear plus helplessness, trauma. And it's that severity and the combination that's really important here. As if we're in a situation where we're very afraid, but yet we feel equipped and we feel powerful to act, our risk of trauma is greatly reduced. Now, equally, if I am holding my child tightly and I'm playfully tickling them on the tummy and she's giggling, you know, she might feel physically quite helpless, but there's no fear. So this is not a traumatizing situation. Now, the most challenging and deeply painful trauma responses we have are actually the things that are caused by other human beings. So yes, absolutely. We can have trauma, traumatization, perhaps post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after a one-off bad car crash, you know, in an otherwise decent life. But that type of situation will be vastly more amenable to recovery and full healing than the fear plus helplessness and the trauma that can be caused by interpersonal abuse and violence against us by other people. And that's particularly people who should be there to love and cherish us. Okay, and this is particularly the case for children. And for all of us, please always remember that every adult had a childhood that shaped them. Okay, because trauma on the developing brain shapes the child, shapes the person biologically, psychologically, across their whole development. And basically that child or person becomes wired and resilient to survive a dangerous world. And this has many, many advantages to survival, but it tends to come at a cost to their whole person development, their relationship with themselves, their relationship to other people and the world, and their health. Now, just going back to that trauma equation, we also now have two big clues on actions that we can use to reduce trauma and reduce re-traumatization. So if we want to prevent harm and we want to support recovery, we therefore want to do whatever is needed to help ourselves or others feel safer physically and emotionally. So we want to reduce fear. And we want to do what we need to do to increase a sense of autonomy and control. So we want to reduce helplessness. Now that can be very practical at individual levels. You know, if you think about what healthy parenting should allow to flourish in a child, a sense of safety, of having a voice and actions that matter in the world and make a difference. You know, this is such a different outcome to an abused child who may feel chronically emotionally and physically unsafe, rejected and helpless, even if those feelings are actually hidden deep down. Another simple practical outworking in a hospital setting for me would be when I take a blood test from an anxious child. So I will deliberately introduce myself, you know, explain simply, well, this is what we need to do. This is why we need to do it. And then I ask the child, right, would you like the important job of holding the cotton wool? Would you like to choose your plaster? Okay, so now we're doing the blood test together. I've reduced their sense of fear and I've reduced their sense of helplessness. So the chance of this child now being very stressed or even traumatized by this medical action is now massively reduced. And remembering this equation can help all the way up to tackling systems that cause fear and helplessness. So for me, that's part of tackling the problematic and the traumatic asylum systems in the UK, for example. And for those of us for whom our Christian faith is important, I hope you're reminded here too that in this broken, painful world where the risks of great fear, helplessness and trauma abound, actually God offers us the protection factors and the conditions for healing. You know, he offers himself as ultimate safety and he offers himself as ultimate power. And that's through a healing and flourishing relationship with him. And I'll share more thoughts about that at the end. So now we know what can lead to a trauma response, fear plus helplessness. Let's look at what trauma can look like so we can recognize it in everyday life, not just with sort of a diagnostic clinical lens. Now, firstly, we need to remember that all of us is present when life hurts. It's not just our brain. It's not just our mental health. You know, all of us was there. All of us feels the severe distress and all of us responds. You know, we are whole people. So fear and trauma responses are not just all in our head. Now, our body has very powerful danger response system. And this is, of course, vital in a broken world. You know, this here is an artist's impression of the Garden of Eden. But after the fall, of course, when that relationship between man and the rest of nature was fractured, humans would not have survived without recognizing the new danger around them. You know, the Bible would have been incredibly short. So let's remind ourselves now of some of these whole body responses to danger. Now, only if you feel safe to do so, just imagine I've been out on a walk, I'm exploring somewhere new, but now it's got dark and I'm lost in the forest. And somebody told me there are wolves in this forest, which is why no locals go here at night. My phone has no signal. And I'm now feeling really, really scared, alone and helpless. So what will be happening to me? Firstly, my heart's going to be pounding, pumping oxygen around my body to prepare me to run, prepare me to fight, be aggressive against danger in order to survive whatever might be out there, whatever might come. My breathing, it's going to be rapid. I'm going to be sucking in oxygen needed for my muscles to make me run or fight danger. My muscles will be tense. even painfully so, ready for action. Or I might feel weak, floppy, like jelly. My gut will be churning. It's going to want to release bowel and bladder content to help me be quicker to protect myself, lighter. All my thoughts are going to be focused on danger. This is no longer a beautiful forest. Every sound to me is a threat to my life. Every sound to me is now a wolf. Now, I might be stuck here all night long, but I will not sleep well. And that's logical, isn't it? Because if I go into a deep sleep, surrounded by wolves, that would be very foolish for me. That would be very dangerous for me. So I will not have deep sleep. Now, all these thoughts and sensations might be very unpleasant, but actually, of course, they are there to protect me and help me survive a situation that could risk my life. Now, let me ask you, how many of you have felt these type of feelings in recent months when work has been exhausting and stressful, the economy is collapsing because of the pandemic, or perhaps you've been impacted by conflict or violence? Perhaps you have laid in your bed, unable to sleep, wondering what's wrong with you, hating that you can't sleep. Perhaps you've lost your appetite and your guts are uncomfortable. Perhaps you are agitated, irritable, you're in fight mode. Everything feels like more pressure. Even what you used to love feels like more pressure. Perhaps you can't think straight and you're stuck in your studies. Now, often we feel these things and then we blame ourselves. We think that we're not good at our jobs, or that we're just not coping, that we're weak in some bad way. But as we've seen, actually, these experiences are the result of our incredible body stepping up to say to us, I recognize there is significant danger around you, and now all your systems are active to protect you. So our bodies are not against us, they are for us. Okay, so what happens when we are confronted with significant danger? And this danger might be a lion, it might be a soldier with a gun, it could be 300 urgent emails or an exam. And these are things that can trigger a deep fear of being rejected by family or society. Perhaps it's a sudden bereavement. So in that case, our brainstem is activated, triggering our threat response. The amygdala in our limbic system, in that area of the brain, alerts the entire body to danger through a hormonal cascades. And that sends us into a fight, aggressive, flight, run away, freeze, or flop response. And that's because sometimes staying still or playing dead might be the best protection. So these hormones include adrenaline for aggression and defense, cortisol for an energy rise or an energy flop, natural opioids as painkillers, and oxytocin acting as physical and emotional pain blocker. And interestingly, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. And this is in part because by turning off that deep thinking area of the brain, we don't delay immediately protecting ourselves by wasting time thinking about the small details. Now, also, our Broca's area of our brain goes offline, our speech area. So this is why we either are or we say, I'm speechless in the face of something terrible, and why talking about trauma is so hard. And it's also important to remember that when we're working with patients and we teach these things to the police, to healthcare, to emergency services, who respond to incidents and they ask people, what happened? Tell me what happened. Say what happened. And then they find the victim cannot speak or give information, or they can't remember what happened. They're muddled. You know, the victim might be bleeding and hurt, but they're also laughing because they're flooded with oxytocin and natural painkillers. And it's so important to know that this is not a sign of bad behavior, drunkenness, being unhelpful. It shows that something genuinely traumatic has happened and they're experiencing survival responses. We also want to remember that the fight, flight, freeze, flop, or even instinctively trying to please a perpetrator of harm to protect ourselves, those are deep subconscious responses. They're not aligned with our moral principles, with our logic. These are instinctive, automatic survival mode functions. So there's no blame or shame what happens in these moments. This is very, very different to planned or chosen activities. But when there has been serious danger, hopefully most of the time, things calm down again. You know, the danger passes, we become safe and we believe we are safe, or at least safer. We're comforted by at least one person who cares about us. And then we start to move forward, we process it. But sometimes the experience is so big and overwhelming, or we can't get safe, or we don't get the kind of support that we need. And that's when the trauma responses, the overwhelm of that fear plus helplessness can kick in and become more chronic. And trauma can feel like many things. It can feel like being stuck in survival mode, so always feeling in great danger. So there's very little extra free space in your life for fun, for creativity, for relationships, because you're always watching out for threats against you. It can feel like body pain, you know, or body memories of trauma, which might be separated in the brain from the thought memory and words around why I even feel that pain. So we can have body memories. It can feel like the whole world has changed forever and is no longer safe. Like we don't know what's past and we don't know what's present. Okay, and that can certainly happen in flashbacks. It's not remembering something from back then, it's I am in immediate danger right now, is felt across our whole body. Emotions can be strong, feeling sad, lonely, hopeless. Like we've said, it can be really hard to talk about what has happened. And it can be hard to stay present and to concentrate. Other things can make it difficult too. Guilt and shame can make us feel really bad, make us want to hide. Lack of deep sleep, bad dreams make us very tired, and we know the impacts of sleep deprivation on health, on thinking, on well-being. And then grief often accompanies traumatic events, and that's a different type of sorrow. Trauma can also feel like a soul injury. Okay? It can shake up our identity, our sense of purpose, our faith. It can feel like we've lost the story of who we are and the story of how our lives should have been. And these experiences can help affect us in healthy or less healthy ways, you know, towards a life that hides more away from danger, or into fresh decisions that help us thrive. And most of us will move through different responses as part of our recovery journeys. And in reality, recovery from trauma is not about instant expert psychotherapy, you know, nor is this available for most people on the planet anyway. It also isn't a simple journey. But what we can do is start with the basics. And, you know, for those of us who will benefit from the blessing of mental health expertise later down the line, we want to build the best foundation for recovery that we can from what we have to hand. So what simple, practical things can we do to help ourselves, to help others, when we're feeling very fearful or we have experienced trauma? So firstly, we want to do some really practical things to increase safety and reduce fear through our body. So we want to get to the safest physical place available to us. If we need first aid because we are injured, we need to remember that we may also be numbing pain as a protective response. So we want to do physical things that remind our body and mind of safety and love. So this might be wearing very cozy clothing, wrapping in a blanket, receiving safe touch, physical comfort from a friend or safe person, wrapping your hands around a warm drink. You know, even adults may take comfort from a childhood toy or something soft and fluffy that speaks to our body and brain of safety. We want to eat some food if you possibly can. That's for energy and to reduce the fear of lack of food, so that sensation of hunger. So if you've got smells, scents, sounds that remind you of safe or loving people, perhaps a perfume, or a particular food smell, make use of them. And you can calm a worried mind by focusing on things you can see, smell, touch, taste, or feel through your body senses. Choose neutral things or pleasant things, okay, especially if the environment is difficult. You want to breathe slow and steadily and sense your heart rate settle down. And then once you feel safer, you will start to think more clearly, because you are bringing your prefrontal cortex back online. Secondly, let's see what we can do to increase felt safety and reduce fear through our mind. Okay, so firstly, we need to be very, very kind to ourselves. Now, as health professionals, we are often great at extending compassion to patients, but we can be very harsh on ourselves and perhaps even on our colleagues. So we want to remind ourselves that we're still going through a very difficult time. That stress responses, danger responses, trauma responses are all understandable. Okay? We want to speak to ourselves as if we would speak to our very best friend. Do not look in the mirror and speak negative and shaming things over ourselves. Speak love, life, and hope. We know from research that we listen to ourselves and we believe what we say about ourselves. So be careful what we speak over ourselves. Remember that our mind, brain, and body are not our enemy. So practice gratitude for their responses to keep you safe. And I do this very practically. So for example, I had a season of nightmares and visions following a terrible child abuse case that I worked with. And I would literally say to myself, sometimes again and again, thank you, brain, thank you, body, for looking after me. I know there was danger then, but it's okay now. I'm safe. You can step down. And how can we increase our sense of autonomy and control and reduce that sense of felt helplessness? You know, it's about starting some action. What small things can help you feel a bit more in control and active in our lives? Could we get washed and dressed if this has been hard? If we're in a new country, could we learn one new word that day or one new way to buy something we need? Could we make a decision that does good? You know, a more nutritious food choice, a walk, helping a friend? Could we pray if that has been very difficult? Now, I know these things can sound silly or patronizing, but actually, if you are in the depths of a trauma freeze response, or you are utterly exhausted, it might be the hardest thing you do all day to even get out of your bed. And to celebrate that is a small victory. So do not despise the small things in that recovery journey. And we encourage further healing through safe relationships. So for most of us, our best counselors are actually our good friends around us. You know, it's people who help heal what people have hurt. And this is also why healthy churches are vehicles for healing. If we have been hurt in a relationship, we need to heal through relationship. We want to be spending time together, sharing music and rhythm, and that has important impacts on the brain. We want to play, we want to share food. We want to celebrate even tiny things and to do so without guilt. You want to pray and worship together. You want to support each other to feel safe and to rest, whatever that looks like in that scenario. But of course, sometimes we might all need extra help, and this is when survival mode is no longer a really appropriate short-term response to sudden or extreme experience of danger or trauma, but it becomes overwhelming and it actually stops us being able to thrive. So expert help is needed if ourselves, our patient, a friend is experiencing distress that could lead to somebody being hurt. If there are pre-existing mental health conditions and there's extra support, extra medication is required. And if you're still experiencing trauma symptoms, anxiety, mood difficulties at least a month after getting into a safe place. And when there's no access to specialist help, which I know is the case for very many of us, you're not stranded and helpless. Just keep working small step by small step through your self-care. Stay connected into healthy friendship groups. And actually, in many cases, the majority of cases, we journey through healing over time and in safe, supportive relationship with others. So please do not feel helpless until you receive high expert psychotherapy. There is so much we can do in the wait and in healing in that space. And just before we finish, I want to add some things that I've learned about faith and fear through my work and through some really difficult recent years. Okay, so firstly, I believe that repeated command in the Bible, do not fear, is fundamentally about aligning what is truly worthy of our fear with God's word. Okay? It's not about denying a functioning danger response system or having zero feelings, no matter the horror around us. It is not a sin or wrong to detect danger and threat in our environment and feel it or see it in the face of another person. We are made to be sensitive to the world around us and to feel it. But learning to submit our everyday fears through to our catastrophic fears to God is a journey for our whole life. As we experience pain, mental health challenges as Christians too. And as we read the Bible, I think over and over again, we see that we can have deep faith and face deep challenges at the same time. I also want to remind us to be careful not to over-spiritualize natural and normal body and thought reactions. So I mentioned about my nightmares after the child abuse case. So that wasn't caused by something demonic. It was a logical danger alert signal from my brain in that circumstance. Okay, and in my work with victims of human trafficking, I see how spiritual abuse is used to control victims by making them believe that their trauma responses, such as nightmares and being unable to sleep, mean that they are under the power of a trafficker or that they are being punished by evil spirits. Okay, so perpetrators create this powerful controlling lie around the experience of normal survival responses, trauma responses we know about, which adds greatly to the victim's trauma. And what I've also seen is that the closer we draw to God, who is, like we said, our ultimate safety, the one who has ultimate power, that things that used to trigger our fear become smaller and lose power. So I will actually ask myself when I feel afraid. Now, in the light of who God says he is this person, this problem or situation ultimately worthy of my fear or not? And the answer is that all these things are not ultimately worthy of my fear, They may well need a wise and a sensitive approach, but God is greater. And, you know, I don't know if any of us this side of heaven will ever be free of fear in this broken world, but to grow in trusting God is this amazing journey with no shame and no blame. And I'm sure it must give God great joy just to see his children trust him just that tiny bit more. So please do take time to grow your faith and biblical knowledge of the character of God. You know, the more deep, wide, and truth-led your relationship with God is, the bigger he will be over your fears, and you'll grow the confidence that even in a dangerous world, even through our very human trauma recovery journeys, our good Father God is with us and holding our hand. Because ultimately life with God is for living abundantly, and it's not just for surviving. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Peter and really look forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that really comprehensive and yet easy to understand presentation of what's a really difficult subject for us, not just personally, but as what we face as doctors as well. For those listeners who get the Doctor's Life Support online, if you don't, you can order it through the ICMDA website. It's free and get a daily devotion. But there was one just a few days ago from Al Weir, an emergency medicine doctor in the US, who described a situation where a patient had come into the accident emergency department and just witnessed someone die next to them, and was absolutely terrified. And the doctor came in and just very quietly said to them, "Do I look worried?" And the patient said no. And he said, "Well, then there's no reason for you to be worried because I've got this." You know, and what I was saying is that we need to remind ourselves that God is in control of situations that feel absolutely and totally out of control to us. Laura, I wonder if I could just ask you, first of all, you've the work you're doing at the moment, your PhDs in human trafficking, you've done a lot of work in this, you're working in charity and justice on this issue as well. Just tell us a little bit about how God led you into that particular line of work, why you took on that challenge.
Yes, absolutely. So it was a long journey for taking up that challenge, really. So I grew up in a Christian home. My dad used to work for organizations such as the World Food Programme, and as a little girl, I would see him travel around the world to work with food crises. And he was always very keen to empower local people to be able to understand their needs and address their needs. So I used to be interested in social justice matters around the world, even from a very young age, and built that into going to medical school, spending time in Nepal, which has a lot of human trafficking. And then later on, I went to church with my husband in London, and there was a guest speaker called Gary Haugen. And Gary Haugen is an American lawyer who was asked to lead the investigation of the Rwandan genocide. And he now leads the International Justice Mission, which is the largest organization addressing human trafficking in the world. And they take a very professional approach, trying to work with justice systems to bring justice to victims of human trafficking. And when I heard him and connected that to my international interests, that's where that started to grow. As a pediatrician, I then got more children who had been trafficked into my clinic, from nations in Africa, from Asia, and then also British children and local children being exploited by drugs gangs. And in front of me, I was measuring the wounds of children. And yes, I felt the systems were not responding as they should. And so it's from that I felt I needed to research this, and have moved into leadership in that field.
Thank you. So Laura, there's a question here from another Laura who's saying, how would you respond to the thought that God's abandonment was the reason for the trauma in the first place, that God has forgotten about me or left me, or perhaps even deliberately put me into this situation where I'm facing this terrible thing.
Peter, do you think Laura's asking from like a one individual's particular feeling of abandonment, or do you think she's talking about at the beginning in the fall?
No, I think she's talking about, well, we don't know for sure, but I took it that she was talking about the feeling that the Christians who face, at some great threat, a sudden bereavement, an unexpected unemployment, a clinical situation beyond their, but they feel is totally beyond their ability to deal with, can sometimes feel that God has left them or abandoned them, and that itself is contributing to the trauma.
Yes, no, and I think if that is a genuine thing that you feel, that does obviously bring a great sorrow to the human heart. And I think that's where, as much as you can before trauma and difficulty strikes in your life, knowing what the Bible says about the character of God and that he does not abandon us, that he does not exist just in the space of our feelings. Like, God does not exist because we feel him or we don't feel him. He doesn't exist because we believe him or we don't believe him. He's not a construct that humans come up with. Then no matter what might be in our emotional space, and obviously our emotions can be affected by so much, from lack of sleep, lack of food, hormones, changes all the time. Then no matter what our emotional understanding is, that we know God hasn't abandoned us, because that is given as a fact and who God is. It is not in his character. And so, yes, there are times when it can feel like God is quiet, but we know he is with us. And the situation you just mentioned there, Peter, we've just walked through an incredibly traumatic sudden bereavement in our family, that felt like the whole floor fell out from underneath us. But even in that pain, there was still a strong sense that God was there. And it's also been a journey for me to understand, I think the character of God is so important, because God is not there to be the great fixer of everything that happens in my life. And if something difficult happens and he doesn't fix it, that's not something against the character of God. Because in a broken world, all through the Bible, he tells us there's pain here, but he tells us he walks with us through the pain. And so I think if you are feeling that abandonment, be careful that you don't elevate the authority of your feelings above the authority of the Bible, which I know is hard, but this is where the Bible tells us, go back to the truth, read it, remember it. See what people in the Bible who have felt like you before, through the Psalms, through Job, the prophets, their journey, learn from those who have gone before you, and know that he is with you, and see where that journey will take you. But these things don't have quick, wee little answers. They're journeys and they're difficult. And God says life is difficult and it's hard to expect trouble, but he is with us. So persevere, keep leaning in, don't lean away from God.
Thank you. Yes, being Christians does not mean that God protects us from stress and threat, but that he's always present within us, with us in it. As the scripture says, when you walk through the fire and the floods, I'll be with you. It's not a guarantee that we won't face those things. So you talked about the effects of early life trauma, and Steve Sturman here is asking, I'm sure you know, Steve, how long can we expect the effects of early life trauma to last. And I'm sure that will depend upon the trauma, the age, the person, and so on. But you know, just some comments on that, general principles.
Yeah, so absolutely. So it does depend on what has happened and the severity, and crucially about the other systems of resilience around that child. And this is where we know that kind, supportive relationships, even in the mix of terrible trauma, can be very protective. So you want to look at the trauma that's happened and the resilience and recovery factors. Okay, but what we do know from the science, particularly the adverse childhood experience studies, the ACE studies, what we know is that if somebody has had early life trauma, and this can mean in the womb, as an infant, as a child, all the way through the developing brain period up to about 26 years of age, we know that if recovery is not supported, then the stress systems can remain activated, they can become dysregulated, and that can increase that person's relative risk compared to somebody who didn't have the trauma of a wide range of physical and mental health problems. So the embodied dysregulated stress increases risk of cancer, mental health problems, autoimmune diseases. It increases people's risk of being perpetrators of violence and victims of violence, a whole huge raft of things. And these studies have been done around the world. So this is why it's crucial that we want to prevent as much trauma as possible, particularly for children. We want to be supporting recovery, and we want to, as professionals, work in a trauma-informed manner that recognizes it, but doesn't shame or blame people for having survival mode responses, and that we work with people towards recovery, not just labeling them, calling them bad people, bad children, because they are in fight mode, or they are running out of classrooms, or whatever it is. So that understanding is part of the system. So it can have an impact throughout the whole life course, but equally, as we grow, we develop, as we get support, things heal, we recover. We're always dealing with something in the world, and we shape and we change. But the science is very strong that early life trauma is not good for us and can have a health impact on the whole life course.
Sure.
It doesn't have to, but it can do.
Sure. Can an unhealthy trauma response be reversed to a healthy response and healing, or is the damage done always going to be there?
No, recovery is possible. Absolutely. So trauma responses are normal in the circumstance of being having had a traumatic experience. Okay, so these are the survival mode responses that come to help us. And when they get stuck, that's when we can have challenges. But absolutely, we know that recovery is possible. Okay, so we don't need to be fatalistic. We don't ever need to feel that we are doomed, or a patient or family member is doomed because they had a difficult start or they've had a difficult experience. What is key is those safe, supportive relationships. There is a lot of information and help out there about how to support ourselves recover. And for some people, expert trauma psychotherapy, trauma treatment, perhaps mental health treatment too, for depression, anxiety, other connected issues, all helps. It's all really important. So certainly from the perspective of the researchers and the teams I work with, we very strongly believe in recovery. Now, this may take different shapes and forms. I don't mean pretending it never happened. I mean recovery and resilience that grows through a difficulty. But yes, recovery is possible. So we don't want to be fatalistic about anybody who's been through a difficult time.
Thank you. There's a question here about the abused abuser, which you didn't specifically mention in the talk, but the questioner says, although we shouldn't take this fatalistically and deterministically, do you have any views or know of any neural factors in particular why there seems often to be this almost self-repeating phenomenon that a person who was abused then becomes an abuser, whereas in others, their own bad experiences can make them much less likely to act as abusers in the future. Why is it that we see this pattern?
Yeah, great comment and question. So we often hear the phrase hurt people. But actually that can feel quite deterministic. It can make people feel that, well, if something bad happened to me, I'm destined to cause harm to other people. But in reality, most people who have been hurt, actually, they know what that feels like and they want to help other people. So if you look at many people who work in the social justice sectors, who work in health sectors, who become doctors, nurses, therapists, many of us have been triggered to do that because we walk through some pain. I work with many survivor leaders. So these are individuals who have experienced violence and abuse and trafficking themselves. And they have risen up to be trained to be leaders in the field and use their experiences of pain to help others, because they don't want other people to feel the hurt. So most hurt people help others. Now, where somebody has experienced a lot of abuse and a lot of pain, they may be living out of their survival mode. And that can include a lot of changes in how we see ourselves, how we see other people, and how we see the world. And the tension and the stress within us, and the sense of abandonment and being hated and no one cares about anyway, can drive very difficult relationships with other people in the world, which can sometimes create an environment where harm is more likely to happen. So this is why we want to consider recovery, why we want to consider support. It's also very important around this not shaming and blaming. Okay, and I know with the definition of criminal acts, that's not to say there was no thought or no choice involved. But say, for example, if we look at our prisons, many people in prison are survivors of childhood abuse, but they have been labeled very early on as bad people from bad families who do bad things. And so what do we do to bad people? We punish them. They haven't been seen as a victim of child abuse. And a victim, if we see somebody as a victim, what do we want to do? We want to help them. We want to care for them. We want to show them a new way, what it feels like to be loved and supported, and shape somebody in a different direction. So this is where understanding trauma and how it outworks changes how we see people, how we see problems, and can help stop some of these generational impacts. And you touched on the generational trauma in a way in that question as well there. And that's where we also need to look at structures and systems that hold whole generations and whole populations and nations in circumstances that hold high people in high stress, in tension, in situations of discrimination and harm. So this is where trauma looks not only at the individual patient, but goes all the way up to looking at systems and structures and governments and policies that all shape the landscape of people's lives, and the pressure that's put on people and the value that's placed on people's lives. And this interconnects with human rights and all these type of things.
Sadly, we're just about out of time, Laura, and we could, I'm sure, go on talking a lot longer, but I just, in closing, just wanted to ask you, it's just thinking about the last few years and these huge things that have happened to the world and have disproportionately impacted some much more than others. I'm thinking about COVID, I'm thinking about the Ukraine war and other wars happening. I'm thinking about the economic crisis, the price of fuel and food and so on at the moment that we're going through, and that many members of ICMDA and the national bodies are impacted by in different ways. But as a Christian and a doctor, are there any particular scriptures, psalms, stories, or whatever that you've found personally helpful, both in this area, both in the in caring for people dealing with trauma, and also in the trauma that's or the stress that's inevitably involved for you and being in such difficult situations? Just anything, just in closing, any particular precious scriptures or stories that have really spoken to you?
I think in the last few weeks, particularly, my attention has been drawn to some of the minor prophets, and also to Daniel, with the real sense that we are not random beings in a random time, but that God has shaped us, even in Daniel and his friend's case, even the appearance of their faces and bodies, when they were born, the type of education they had, their skills, a lot of the minor prophets living lives that were shaped to tell part of God's story to the people. And just that sense of the pandemic made many of us feel that we are lost at sea, that we are helpless, that we are fearful. It was it is a traumatic time, the pandemic. But to be grounded in the stories that God puts in the Bible with so much tiny detail, that we are not random, the time is not random, God's purposes are not random, and to trust that I'm here for a reason, and the wisdom that God has given me, the knowledge he has given me, is purposeful and pertinent to the times. And I think that for all of us, we are all in our place and time for a purpose, and not to forget that in the panic that can seem around us, to ground ourselves in God knows, and I'm here for a reason, and to connect with God about what that reason is, to glorify him. And that also stabilizes us too, because when we're in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, even in a storm, things will move forward in a much better way. So yes, the minor prophets and Daniel, certainly.
Thanks very much, and thanks so much, Laura, for your time, your witness, your preparation, and for the amazing work that you're doing. We wish you God's blessing on that, and to all of you for coming along and being part of this. May the Lord bless you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. Thank you.